The avoidant has learned to interpret every word, every gesture, every attempt at connection as information they can use to maintain their defended position. They have become experts at reading pursuit, at measuring desperation, at calculating exactly how much distance they can create before the empath breaks. The empath's words have provided endless material for the avoidant's defensive strategies. Every explanation became evidence of neediness. Every expression of hurt became proof of instability. Every attempt to understand became justification for further withdrawal. The avoidant has built their relational fortress using the empath's communication as building blocks, transforming genuine attempts at connection into weapons against intimacy itself. Then the words stop. The pursuit ends. The silence arrives, not as temporary withdrawal, but as fundamental shift in the empath's engagement. This quiet communicates truths that pierce the avoidant's defenses more effectively than years of verbal expression ever could. The silence speaks in a language the avoidant cannot misinterpret, cannot deflect, cannot use to reinforce their protective narrative. 4 specific messages transmit through this quiet 4 psychological realities that shake the foundation of the dynamic the avoidant has carefully constructed. These messages reach the avoidant's consciousness, whether they acknowledge them or not, creating internal shifts that no amount of talking could produce. Your silence tells them you are no longer afraid of losing them. Fear has been the invisible architecture supporting the entire relational dynamic. The empath's fear of losing the avoidant, of being abandoned, of facing the relationship's end, drove their pursuit with relentless intensity. This fear manifested in countless ways: the anxious text checking on the avoidant's emotional state, the careful monitoring of the avoidant's mood to prevent withdrawal, the constant adjustments to accommodate the avoidant's needs, the willingness to accept breadcrumbs of connection rather than demand genuine presence. The empath's behavior communicated clearly that losing the avoidant represented their greatest terror, that they would tolerate almost anything to prevent the relationship's dissolution. The avoidant recognized this fear and, consciously or unconsciously, used it as leverage. The avoidant understood that the empath's terror of abandonment gave them ultimate control over the relationship's terms. They could withdraw knowing the empath would pursue. They could offer minimal effort knowing the empath would accept it gratefully. They could maintain emotional distance knowing the empath would bridge the gap through their own labor. The empath's fear became the avoidant's power, the guarantee that the avoidant could have connection without vulnerability, relationship without risk. When silence replaces pursuit, this fundamental power structure collapses. The quiet communicates that the empath has released their attachment to the relationship's continuation. The silence does not carry anger or punishment. It holds something far more threatening to the avoidant: indifference born from acceptance. The empath has moved through their fear and arrived at a place where losing the avoidant no longer represents catastrophe. This internal shift manifests as sustained withdrawal of engagement, as refusal to pursue, as comfort with the relationship's potential end. The avoidant feels this shift viscerally, even if they cannot articulate it consciously. They have become attuned to the empath's fear because that fear has fueled the dynamic that allowed the avoidant to remain defended. When the fear dissolves, the avoidant loses their primary tool for maintaining control. They can no longer withdraw and rely on the empath's anxious pursuit to restore connection on the avoidant's terms. They cannot use distance as weapon because the empath no longer experiences distance as threat. The silence communicates that the empath has genuinely detached from the outcome, that they have made peace with whatever unfolds, including the relationship's complete dissolution. This message destabilizes the avoidant profoundly because it reverses the power dynamic they have relied upon. Previously, the avoidant held power through their willingness to withdraw, their comfort with distance, their ability to remain emotionally disconnected. The empath's fear of these things gave the avoidant control. When silence reveals the empath no longer fears what the avoidant threatens, the power shifts entirely. The avoidant confronts the reality that they may care more about maintaining connection than the empath does, that their position of defended distance may cost them the relationship, that their withdrawal may finally succeed in driving the empath away permanently. The psychological impact varies based on the avoidant's actual attachment to the empath. If the avoidance connection has been shallow, based primarily on the ego satisfaction of being pursued and desired, the empath's fearlessness may trigger the avoidant's complete disengagement. The avoidant loses interest when pursuit ends because the pursuit was the point. The relationship held value only insofar as it provided validation through the empath's fear-driven chase. When that chase ends, the avoidant has no remaining investment. This response, while painful, provides the empath with valuable clarity about the relationship's actual emptiness. Your silence tells them they have lost their emotional control over you. The avoidant has wielded emotional control as their primary relational tool. This control manifested through their ability to regulate the empath's emotional state through strategic availability and withdrawal. When the avoidant offered attention, affection, or vulnerability, the empath responded with relief, hope, and intensified investment. When the avoidant withdrew, created distance, or became cold, the empath experienced anxiety, confusion, and desperate attempts to restore connection. This predictable pattern gave the avoidant tremendous power. They could manipulate the empath's emotional state through calculated doses of presence and absence. The empath's responsiveness to this manipulation served the avoidant's defensive needs. The avoidant could feel powerful and in control, while avoiding genuine vulnerability. They could maintain their defended position while still experiencing the ego satisfaction of affecting another person deeply. The empath's emotional reactivity confirmed the avoidant's importance and desirability. Every anxious text, every hurt expression, every desperate attempt at understanding proved that the avoidant mattered, that they held power over someone else's internal state. This power substituted for the intimacy the avoidant could not risk. The avoidant's control extended beyond simply triggering the empath's emotions. They controlled the relationship's entire emotional landscape, determining when connection occurred and when distance prevailed. They decided when the empath received warmth and when the empath faced coldness. They chose when to offer explanation and when to leave the empath confused. They selected when to validate the empath's perceptions and when to deny reality itself. This comprehensive control allowed the avoidant to have relationship entirely on their terms, never risking the vulnerability that mutual emotional influence requires. Silence demolishes this control structure completely. When the empath becomes quiet, they remove themselves from the avoidant's emotional manipulation. The avoidant can no longer regulate the empath's state through strategic availability, because the empath has stopped seeking the avoidant's presence. The avoidant cannot trigger anxiety through withdrawal, because the empath has already withdrawn. The avoidant loses their ability to create hope through intermittent warmth, because the empath no longer orients toward the avoidant's offerings. The entire system of emotional control that the avoidant constructed collapses when the empath exits the dynamic. This loss of control registers as threatening to the avoidant's sense of security. The avoidant has organized their relational approach around maintaining power through emotional manipulation. When that power disappears, the avoidant experiences destabilization. They have not developed capacities for mutual influence, for reciprocal emotional impact, for the vulnerability that genuine relational equality requires. The avoidant only knows how to relate through control. Without control, they have no relational strategy available except complete withdrawal or unprecedented vulnerability. The silence communicates that the empath has reclaimed their emotional autonomy. The quiet demonstrates that the empath's internal state no longer depends on the avoidant's behavior, that the avoidant's withdrawal does not create the chaos it once did, that the avoidant's occasional warmth does not generate the desperate gratitude it previously inspired. The empath has stabilized their emotional experience independent of the avoidant's manipulations. This stabilization represents the ultimate loss of control from the avoidant's perspective. The avoidant often responds to this loss by attempting to reassert control through escalated tactics. They may swing to extremes, offering unprecedented vulnerability to provoke the empath's engagement, or creating dramatic distance to trigger the empath's anxiety. These escalations aim to restore the familiar pattern, where the avoidance behavior determined the empath's emotional state. When silence persists despite escalation, the avoidant must confront that their manipulations no longer work, that they have genuinely lost their power over the empath's internal experience. This recognition creates profound discomfort because the avoidant's defended sense of self has incorporated their relational control. The avoidant has defined themselves partly through their ability to affect others while remaining unaffected themselves, to create emotional impact without experiencing emotional vulnerability. When the empath's silence demonstrates that the avoidant can no longer create impact, the avoidant faces questions about their own significance. If they cannot control the empath's emotional state, if their presence and absence generate no response, what value do they provide? What role do they serve? These questions threaten the avoidant's self-concept more deeply than any verbal confrontation ever could. The empath's previous emotional reactivity, while uncomfortable for the avoidant, confirmed the avoidant's importance and desirability. The tears, anger, and desperate pursuit all validated that the avoidant mattered enough to generate strong feelings. Silence communicates that the avoidant has lost even this validation. The quiet suggests that the avoidant no longer generates emotional response, that their behavior has become irrelevant to the empath's well-being, that they have faded into insignificance. The loss of control also exposes the emptiness of the avoidant's relational approach. When the avoidant could manipulate the empath's emotions, the relationship felt substantial, despite lacking genuine intimacy. The emotional intensity created by the pursuit-withdrawal pattern generated the illusion of significance. The drama and reactivity filled the space where authentic connection should exist. When silence removes the reactivity, the relationship's actual emptiness becomes undeniable. The avoidant confronts that they have been orchestrating emotional chaos rather than building genuine relationship, creating dependence rather than fostering connection. The message transmitted through the empath's emotional autonomy reaches the avoidant at their core defensive structure. The avoidant cannot maintain their defended position while simultaneously asserting importance in the empath's life. If they genuinely do not care about intimate connection, the empath's emotional autonomy should not matter. If the empath's silence bothers them, it reveals that they desire influence and impact, that they want to matter to the empath. This contradiction exposes the falseness of the avoidant's claimed indifference. The silence forces the avoidant to acknowledge, at least to themselves, that they want connection even as their defensive structure prevents them from pursuing it vulnerably. Your silence tells them you see their pattern clearly now. The avoidance defensive strategies have operated most effectively under conditions of confusion and ambiguity. When the empath remained uncertain about the avoidance behavior, when patterns remained unclear beneath the chaos of pursuit and withdrawal, the avoidant could maintain their defended position without exposure. The empath's confusion served protective function for the avoidant. As long as the empath questioned their own perceptions, wondered if they were too sensitive or demanding, doubted whether the avoidance withdrawal truly constituted a pattern, the avoidant faced no accountability for their emotional unavailability. The avoidant actively cultivated this confusion through inconsistency and intermittent reinforcement. Moments of genuine warmth interspersed with extended coldness created cognitive dissonance that prevented the empath from seeing clearly. Occasional vulnerability mixed with habitual emotional distance made the empath question whether the avoidant was truly unavailable or simply struggling with issues the empath should compassionately accommodate. Periodic promises of change followed by return to familiar patterns kept the empath hoping rather than recognizing. This strategic inconsistency obscured the underlying pattern of defensive withdrawal. The avoidant also used deflection and projection to maintain ambiguity about their behavior. When the empath attempted to address the avoidant's withdrawal, the avoidant redirected focus onto the empath's communication style, emotional expression, or relationship expectations. The conversation that should have examined the avoidance pattern instead became analysis of the empath's supposed dysfunction. The avoidant suggested that their withdrawal was reasonable response to the empath's neediness, that their distance protected them from the empath's excessive demands, that their unavailability reflected the empath's failure to create safety. These deflections prevented clear recognition of the avoidant's consistent pattern. Silence emerges only after the empath has achieved clarity about the pattern. The quiet does not come from confusion or uncertainty, but from recognition and acceptance. The empath has stopped pursuing because they finally see the pattern clearly. They understand that the avoidance withdrawal is not about them, not temporary, not something they can fix through better communication or more patience. The empath recognizes that the avoidance behavior follows predictable defensive logic regardless of the empath's actions. This clarity transforms the empath's experience from anxious confusion to calm understanding. The silence communicates this clarity more effectively than words ever could. When the empath explained their observations verbally, the avoidant could deflect, deny, or reframe. The avoidant could claim the empath misunderstood, overreacted, or imagined patterns that did not exist. Verbal articulation of the pattern gave the avoidant material to work with, arguments to refute, perceptions to challenge. Silence offers nothing to argue against. The quiet simply demonstrates that the empath has seen enough, understood enough, and accepted enough to stop engaging with the dynamic entirely. This message threatens the avoidant profoundly because their defensive structure relies on others not seeing them clearly. The avoidant has organized their psychology around maintaining a particular image: independent, self-sufficient, emotionally stable, reasonable. They present their withdrawal as healthy boundary setting, their emotional distance as appropriate autonomy, their unavailability as self-protection from others' dysfunction. When someone sees through this presentation to the defensive fear underneath, the avoidant's entire self-narrative faces exposure. The empath's silence reveals they have penetrated the avoidant's carefully constructed facade. The quiet communicates recognition that the avoidant's independence masks fear of dependence, that their emotional stability disguises inability to access vulnerable feelings, that their self-sufficiency conceals terror of needing others. The silence says, the empath understands that the avoidance withdrawal is not strength but defense, not preference but compulsion, not choice but conditioned response to intimacy-related anxiety. This level of clarity strips away the avoidant's protective narratives. The avoidant often experiences this exposure as deeply uncomfortable even when nothing is explicitly stated. They sense that the empath no longer accepts their explanations or believes their justifications. The avoidant recognizes that the empath has stopped trying to understand because the empath finally does understand. This recognition creates vulnerability the avoidant has spent their life avoiding. Being truly seen, having their defensive patterns recognized and named even silently, threatens the psychological structure that protects the avoidant from overwhelming feelings of inadequacy and fear. The clarity that silence communicates also eliminates the avoidant's ability to gaslight or manipulate the empath's perceptions. The avoidant can no longer suggest that patterns do not exist when the empath has stopped debating their existence. The avoidant cannot convince the empath that their perceptions are distorted when the empath has withdrawn from conversation entirely. The silence demonstrates that the empath trusts their own observations more than the avoidant's reframing, that the empath has stopped seeking the avoidant's validation of their reality. This shift represents fundamental loss of control for the avoidant. The pattern recognition that produces silence also reveals to the avoidant that their behavior has been predictable rather than mysterious or complex. The avoidant may have believed their emotional unavailability was subtle, that their defensive withdrawal was not obvious, that their pattern was difficult to detect. The empath's silence communicates that the pattern was actually transparent, that the defensive strategies were recognizable, that the avoidant's behavior followed such consistent logic that engagement became pointless. This recognition can wound the avoidant's ego, confronting them with their own psychological simplicity rather than the complexity they imagine. The message transmitted through pattern recognition reaches the avoidant's awareness regardless of whether they acknowledge it consciously. The avoidant knows at some level that they have been seen, that their defensive strategies have been identified and catalogued, that they can no longer hide behind confusion or ambiguity. This knowledge creates pressure toward either authentic self-examination or complete relational termination. The middle ground where the avoidant could maintain defended position while keeping the empath engaged no longer exists. The silence says the empath has seen enough to make a decision, has recognized enough to stop hoping for change, has understood enough to protect themselves through withdrawal. The avoidant may attempt to restore ambiguity through sudden behavioral shifts designed to confuse the empath's newly achieved clarity. They might offer unprecedented vulnerability, make dramatic promises of change, or display emotions they have never shown. These attempts aim to make the empath question whether they truly saw the pattern clearly, whether perhaps the avoidant is capable of change, whether maybe the relationship could transform. When silence persists despite these maneuvers, the avoidant must accept that the empath's clarity is solid, that pattern recognition cannot be undone through temporary behavioral adjustment, that the empath has moved beyond hoping for transformation. Your silence tells them you have chosen yourself over the relationship. The empath's natural orientation toward connection and harmony has consistently prioritized relationship maintenance over self-protection. Throughout the dynamic with the avoidant, the empath sacrificed their own needs, suppressed their authentic feelings, and accommodated the avoidant's limitations in service of preserving the relationship. The empath tolerated breadcrumbs of affection when they deserved consistent presence. They accepted explanations that dismissed their legitimate concerns. They modified their natural emotional expression to avoid triggering the avoidant's withdrawal. The empath's behavior communicated that maintaining connection with the avoidant mattered more than honoring their own well-being. This self-abandonment served the avoidant's defensive needs perfectly. The avoidant could remain emotionally unavailable while the empath compensated through increased effort and accommodation. The avoidant never faced consequences for their withdrawal because the empath absorbed all relational costs. The dynamic functioned smoothly from the avoidant's perspective, because one person sacrificed themselves to maintain connection, while the other person maintained defensive distance. The avoidant came to expect and depend on the empath's willingness to prioritize relationship over self. Silence represents the empath's fundamental reorientation from relationship focus to self-focus. The quiet communicates that the empath has stopped sacrificing their well-being for connection that depletes rather than nourishes. The silence emerges when the empath finally chooses their own peace over the relationship's continuation, their own emotional health over the avoidant's comfort, their own truth over harmony purchased through self-betrayal. This choice manifests as withdrawal of the effort that has sustained the relationship despite its profound imbalance. The message this choice transmits destabilizes the avoidant's expectations entirely. The avoidant has operated under the assumption that the empath would indefinitely prioritize relationship maintenance. The avoidant believed they could remain defended while the empath did the work of connection, that they could withdraw while the empath pursued, that they could offer minimal effort while the empath provided maximum accommodation. The empath's silence reveals these assumptions were wrong, that the empath's patience has limits, that continued self-abandonment in service of the relationship is no longer acceptable. This realization confronts the avoidant with accountability they have avoided through the entire relationship. As long as the empath prioritized connection over self, the avoidant never had to change or grow. The relationship continued regardless of the avoidant's emotional unavailability because the empath compensated for what the avoidant could not provide. When the empath chooses themselves, the avoidant faces the reality that the relationship cannot continue on the previous terms. The avoidant must either develop new capacities or accept the relationship's dissolution. The choice that allowed comfortable distance while maintaining connection no longer exists. The silence communicates that the empath has recognized their own worth independent of the relationship. Throughout the pursuit-withdrawal dynamic, the empath's sense of value became entangled with the avoidant's intermittent validation. When the avoidant offered attention, the empath felt worthy. When the avoidant withdrew, the empath questioned their value. This external regulation of self-worth kept the empath trapped in pursuit of the avoidant's approval. The quiet demonstrates that the empath has relocated their sense of worth internally, that they no longer require the avoidant's validation to know their value. This shift threatens the avoidant's position because it eliminates their leverage. The avoidant's power derived partly from the empath's dependence on the avoidant for self-worth confirmation. When the empath needed the avoidant's approval, the avoidant could withhold or grant it strategically to maintain control. When the empath no longer seeks this approval, when silence reveals self-possession and internal validation, the avoidant loses their ability to manipulate through intermittent reinforcement. The empath's choice of self over relationship demonstrates that the avoidant has become optional rather than essential to the empath's sense of value. The prioritization of self that silence communicates also reveals the empath's growing understanding that the relationship was extractive rather than reciprocal. The empath gave consistently while the avoidant took selectively. The empath offered vulnerability while the avoidant maintained walls. The empath provided emotional labor while the avoidant conserved their energy for self-protection. This imbalance drained the empath while serving the avoidant's defensive needs. The silence says the empath has recognized this extraction and chosen to stop participating in their own depletion. The avoidant may respond to this message with attempts to restore the previous dynamic, where the empath prioritized relationship over self. The avoidant might suddenly display need, manufacturing situations that would previously have activated the empath's caretaking impulses. They might offer just enough vulnerability to tempt the empath back into relationship focus. They might create crises that demand the empath's attention and energy. These tactics aim to pull the empath out of self-focus and back into the familiar role of relationship maintainer at personal cost. When silence persists despite these manipulations, the avoidant must confront that the empath has fundamentally changed priorities. The quiet withstands the avoidant's attempts to restore the old pattern. The empath maintains self-focus even when the avoidant presents opportunities to abandon themselves again. This consistency demonstrates that the empath's choice was not temporary reaction or strategic withdrawal, but genuine reorientation of values and boundaries. The silence says the empath has learned that relationships requiring constant self-abandonment are not worth maintaining, regardless of the avoidant's intermittent offerings. The message of self-prioritization reaches the avoidant as both loss and liberation. The avoidant loses the relationship structure that allowed defended distance while maintaining connection. They lose access to the empath's effort, accommodation, and pursuit. They lose the ego satisfaction of being desired despite offering minimal reciprocity. Yet the avoidant also receives liberation from the weight of the empath's hope and expectation. The silence releases the avoidant from the discomfort of disappointing someone who keeps believing in their potential for change. The quiet frees the avoidant to either examine their defensive structure without the empath's presence complicating that work, or to find another person willing to accommodate their emotional unavailability. The choice the empath makes through silence ultimately serves both people if the avoidant can receive the message without defensive distortion. The empath reclaims their well-being and stops participating in a dynamic that depleted them. The avoidant faces clear consequences for their defensive patterns, consequences that create potential catalyst for genuine growth, if the avoidant possesses capacity and willingness for self-examination. The silence communicates that the empath values themselves enough to walk away from what does not serve them, a message that simultaneously honors the empath's worth and offers the avoidant opportunity to choose differently if they find the motivation to risk what their defensive structure has prevented them from accessing: genuine vulnerable connection with another human being.